Hi there, I'm Ger McDermott and thank you for watching Dukascopy TV today. Well, I am joined in the studio by Mike Coady from deVere Financial Planning Group to have a look at tax and a new system that's introduced in the UK. So Mike, welcome today.
Good afternoon.
Mike, there has been a new system introduced in the UK to determine someone's tax residence status. Now, why and when did this actually all come about?
Okay, so it started as early as 2011 when they introduced what's called the statutory residency test. And over the last 18 months, 2 years, has been a consultation period. So effectively, it was going to be launched in 2012. The HRMC pushed that back to this year, 2013, and under consultation has identified more of a clear, transparent picture of what a UK tax resident looks like.
And who is most likely to be affected by these changes?
I think first and foremost you look at British people. Official figures suggest that there are 4.5 million British expats that live around the world. The realisation is those figures are much likely to be higher than they are, and also confirms people that are living not only just internationally but also moving to the UK as well, that will be deemed resident once they move back to the UK, even if they're from a different nationality.
So Mike, first of all, can you tell me what exactly is the old system?
Okay, expats have worked on the old system for decades. The understanding has always been very simple in so much that we always knew that you shouldn't spend any more than 183 days in any 1 year in the UK, otherwise by automation you'd be a taxed UK resident. But over a consecutive 4-year period you shouldn't spend on average any more than 90 days each year during that 4-year period. So those classifications would, as I say, would classify you into a UK tax resident. Then over the last few years, up until the new statutory residency test, we've moved into somewhat of a grey area, and I think the need for the new rules, whereby we've looked more at a centre of influence. So although somebody may be living overseas, although somebody may be obeying the 90-day tax rule, we've seen people that have too much of their lifestyle still within the UK, whether that be their family, their home, their golf membership, their banking accounts, their sphere of influence almost, hence the new rules.
So Mike, what exactly do the new rules look like?
Okay, essentially you fall into 3 distinct categories. Those where you're 100% not resident, those where you're 100% resident, and for most people where they'll fall in the midsection where it needs some sort of calculation. If we look at 100% resident, typically you'd suggest that was somebody that was resident in the UK for more than 183 days, that had a family home or their residential property in the UK, but didn't have a residential address or property elsewhere in the world, and or worked full-time in the UK. So that 100% puts you into the residency status. If you go into the non-residency status, for somebody that hasn't lived in the UK for the previous 3 years, they would have up to 46 days of which they can be in the UK while still being a non-resident. A day more and they would be classified into the next band. If you'd spent time in the UK during the last 3 years, then at that point you would only be allowed 16 days. 1 day after that, you go into the classification banners. So at the moment they call these tiers, and essentially there are 5 tiers. One is accommodation. Do you have accommodation or access to accommodation? And I think that's key. So it doesn't necessarily need to be your own home. It could be access to a sister, a brother, a parental property that you can freely use. The next tier is where are your family based. So if your family are based in your residential property in the UK, even though you might be working in another country, that essentially classifies as a tier, okay, and against the point system. The third point is, did you spend time in the previous tax year in the UK? Do you have working obligations in the UK? So you're allowed a certain number of days, typically working more than 3 hours a day, and that includes receiving emails, making business phone calls. And then the last one is, did you spend more time in the UK than any other country for which you visited or spent time in or resided in? And if those are the cases, then you take your tiers, you then go into a matrix system, and then somewhere between 16 and 183 days will be the number of days that you can spend in the UK while still remaining a non-tax resident. 1 day more than that, then you become a UK tax resident for tax purposes.
And bearing all this in mind, what are some specific practical considerations that should be looked at?
I think the difference between the new scheme and the old scheme is I think the new scheme is much more difficult in terms of it requires a certain degree of planning. Mm-hmm. Historically, knowing that you worked overseas and you only had 30 days holiday allowance, that if you only spent your 30 days holiday allowance in the UK, by default, you weren't necessarily a UK tax resident. And I think for most people that was fairly easy to follow. The new system, particularly once we go into the I'm in between, definitely not tax resident and definitely not I am a tax resident, and then you go into the tick boxes, it's the classification of what classifies as property. So most people, when they see accommodation, would identify that as I don't own a house, so I'm okay on that one. But actually the rules suggest that if you have access to a property, even could be a parent, an auntie, a sister, a brother, for a period of time, then that would actually classify as your own home. What does a work tie look like? Am I on holiday but I'm doing blackberries throughout the day? So again, I think the need to sit down with a financial planner, in some respects your legal advisor and or an accountant, to gauge the information that is now available as to what makes you tax resident and what makes you not tax resident. And I think people need to start thinking much more clearly as to how in which they enter and leave the UK. And
finally, Mike, it certainly seems that seeking advice in this matter should be quite a priority for many people. Would you agree?
I think it's huge. But once again, the reason for the new tax rules is there's been so many court cases in the last couple of years where people have followed the previous guidelines laid down by the HMRC. For example, previous rules whereby you could have 90 days, but the day of travel didn't count. So if you came on a Friday and left on a Sunday, technically speaking, you only had one day. And that's seen, a number of high-profile people caught out in various tax legislation. We've seen pilots that live in South Africa who fly into the UK, and because they have a base there before they start work, again, even though they ignore or fall outside of the 90-day rule, means again they've fallen into the trap. So there's a huge number of court cases that have been through, a number of cases that are going through in the very near future. So I would hope and trust that the new rules give much more clarity to a world that's been very unclear for a number of years. But a great time to start planning and really take guidance from a good financial planner, accountant and or solicitor.
Thanks a million, Mike, for your advice and your knowledge today.
Thanks.
Well, viewers, that is it for right now, but do stay tuned as we have lots of interesting programs coming up in the show. So see you later.